All right, today we're tackling the Reformation. But forget the dry, dusty version you might remember from a textbook. We're going to get into the truly shocking, explosive moments that basically lit a fuse under all of Europe and really ended up reshaping the entire world. So here's the big question that sits at the heart of it all. How on earth did a single monk posting a list of academic arguments manage to shatter a unified Christian Europe, an empire that had stood for 1,000 years? How did that lead to the rise of modern nations and, tragically, to wars that would kill millions of people? It sounds impossible. Okay, let's get into it. Our story kicks off in a world that feels incredibly old but also strangely familiar, a world right on the verge of a fire that nobody would be able to control. You have to understand, in the early 16th century, the Catholic Church was, well, it was everything. It was the absolute center of everyone's spiritual, political, and social universe. But under the surface, things were getting tense. See, the church was funding these massive projects, like rebuilding St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and one way they did that was by selling indulgences. These were basically certificates promising to reduce your time in purgatory. For a lot of people, this started to feel less like salvation and more like, well, a cash grab, a feeling that the church was maybe losing its spiritual way. And what's just incredible is the speed of it all. On October 31st, 1517, this monk, Martin Luther, posts his 95 Theses. Now, he wasn't trying to start a revolution. He was just trying to start an academic discussion. But, and this is the key, thanks to the brand new technology of the printing press, his ideas went viral. What should have been a local scholarly debate exploded into an empire-wide crisis in less than 3 years. It got so big that the most powerful man in Europe, the Holy Roman Emperor himself, had to step in. And this leads us to one of the most dramatic showdowns in all of history. In 1521, Luther gets summoned before the Imperial Council, the Diet of Worms. He's ordered to recant, to take it all back. The alternative? Well, that probably meant being burned at the stake. But in front of the emperor, in front of the church, he refused. That one act, one person's conscience against this massive institutional power, that was it. That was the point of no return. The split was now real, and it was going to be irreversible. But Luther's ideas about faith, they didn't just stay in the church. No, they had explosive and, frankly, often unintended consequences in the cutthroat world of politics and power. And from this point, the Reformation really forks onto two very different roads. Over in Germany, Luther's idea that every believer was their own priest, what he called the priesthood of all believers, lit a fire under the peasantry, inspiring a massive, bloody revolt. Luther was horrified and actually sided with the princes to crush them. But then you look at England, and the change came from the top down. It wasn't really about theology at all. It was about King Henry VIII desperately needing a male heir, and the Pope saying no to an annulment. So what did Henry do? He just took over the whole church himself. And for Henry, let's be honest, there was another huge motivator. This number right here, £140,000. That was the estimated annual income the crown grabbed when it dissolved all the monasteries. This wasn't just a religious squabble. This was one of the biggest transfers of wealth in English history, and it completely reshaped the country's economy to fill the king's pockets. But you know, a political takeover like this always has a brutal human cost. Sir Thomas More, the king's own Lord Chancellor, one of the most respected thinkers in all of Europe, refused to accept Henry as the head of the church. And for that act of conscience, he was executed. His death sent a chilling message to everyone. In this New England, loyalty to the king's religion wasn't a choice. So what started as one single split from Rome soon started to multiply. The whole idea of a unified Christian Europe was just gone. And even the new Protestant movement began to splinter into different groups, making any hope of putting things back together totally impossible. Now, faced with this, this was an existential threat. The Catholic Church didn't just roll over. It fought back, hard, with what we now call the Counter-Reformation. This was this huge, organized push to reform problems from within, but also to push back directly against the Protestants. And a huge piece of this was getting everyone together to clarify exactly what it meant to be Catholic. That big meeting, the Council of Trent, went on for almost 20 years. And yeah, it addressed some legitimate issues like corruption in the clergy, but it also doubled down on the core Catholic beliefs that Protestants had rejected. So the crucial thing to realize is this council didn't heal the split. It solidified it. It drew a final, permanent line in the sand. The schism was here to stay. At the same time, the Protestant movement itself was breaking apart, which proved there wasn't going to be one single alternative to Catholicism. You had Lutheranism, which became very dependent on the German princes who protected it. But then this new, much more radical force showed up with John Calvin. His brand of Protestantism, Calvinism, was super intense, intellectually rigorous, strict, and built around the heavy doctrine of predestination. And crucially, it wasn't tied to any one country. His city-state in Geneva became a kind of blueprint, an exportable model for disciplined religion that spread like wildfire to places like France, Scotland, and the Netherlands. This created yet another major faction on Europe's already fractured map. So what happens when these deep, permanent religious and political divides can't be solved with debate anymore? The answer, tragically, is violence. Violence on a scale Europe had just never seen before. In 1555, they tried to stop the bleeding with a treaty, the Peace of Augsburg. The idea seemed pretty simple. Each ruler gets to decide the religion of their own land, either Catholic or Lutheran. Sounds pragmatic, right? Well, there was a huge fatal flaw. It completely ignored the Calvinists, who were growing faster than anyone. This little omission was basically a ticking time bomb. And that bomb? It went off. In 1572, in France, a state-sanctioned wave of mob violence just erupted against the French Protestants, the Huguenots. This is the estimated number of people killed in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. It was a horrifying sign of just how quickly religious hatred could spiral into absolute butchery. But even that, as horrific as it was just a prelude. All the simmering tensions, Catholic versus Protestant, princes versus the emperor, and that fatal exclusion of the Calvinists, it all finally boiled over into the 30 Years' War. This is the estimated death toll, a staggering 4.5 to 8 million people. This was the devastating grand finale to a century of religious conflict. It left huge parts of Central Europe completely and utterly destroyed. But out of that unbelievable devastation, the survivors had to build something new. And the end of these religious wars actually laid the foundation for the world that we all live in today. The treaty that finally ended all the carnage, the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, was absolutely monumental. It did more than just end a war. It literally remade the map of Europe. First, it finally recognized Calvinism, fixing that time bomb from the old treaty. But here's the really big one. It established the idea of state sovereignty, the principle that nations are independent and they don't answer to some higher religious or imperial power like the Pope or the Emperor. This was basically the birth certificate for the modern system of nation-states. So, it leaves us with this huge question, doesn't it? The Reformation championed individual conscience, and it shattered an ancient empire. But through all that violence and division, did it also accidentally create the blueprint for our modern world of competing, sovereign, and often conflicting nations? It's a pretty shocking legacy, and it all started with one monk's call for a debate. Thanks for joining this explainer.